you have the Emir of Qatar, who off the back of the World Cup has told major organizations to go out there and invest in sport and find a Premier League club.
How are we doing, everyone? This should be, I would say, a very interesting interview. I've got Ben Jacobs here, senior sports broadcaster reporter. I'm not sure how to introduce you there, but Ben is somebody who definitely can help us understand a bit more about this Qatari takeover bid for Manchester United. It's all developed very rapidly, Ben, in these last 10 days or so. Prior to that, any sort of conversation around Qatar and any possibility of coming for Manchester United was around a minority investment, obviously because of the ownership of PSG under the Qatar Sports Investment. What we're going to talk about is the Qatar Investment Authority, what we expect. This is what you're going to help me with, right? In terms of how they're structuring this takeover bid, where the money is actually coming from, what the involvement of Emir Al Thani is going to be. But Ben, thank you very much for your time today, because I think we all need this conversation as United fans.
Absolutely. It's confusing. I think that the different acronyms are so similar as well that people ultimately get mixed up. But we are going to get clarity in the next few days. We should point out at the time of recording, it's Wednesday morning, so a lot can change very fast with the deadline only 2 days away. But I'll certainly do my best to give you an overview of the state of play and who these different organizations are. And then in addition to that, I should point out that I lived in Qatar too. So I know some of these groups relatively well, and that definitely gives you an understanding of overlap. And you're going to hear me say a lot in different questions, things like legal separation versus practical lack of separation. And that's what makes it so confusing. We saw this also with PIF and the Newcastle United takeover, and the way that any government-backed sovereign fund is structured and organized tends to be quite non-transparent, which means that fans will have to do a bit of digging and interpret themselves what they believe to be legitimately legally separate versus the practical overlap between different organizations and personnel, which is to be expected when everybody in Qatar, when they invest in sport, is ultimately fulfilling one thing, which is the government's sports strategy.
Now, so Ben, if we can start the conversation from your own knowledge and your own insight into the Qatari takeover bid, what's the current state of play? How is it developed to this point, and where is it?
Well, I think the where is it is simple, and sources still say at the time of recording that it will be channeled via a private fund. So we've heard a lot about QIA, and I'll explain why they're important. We've obviously seen stories regarding QSI because everybody knows PSG. But if we look at things legally, at least in three different ways, I think fans will start to understand things a bit clearer. And I'm going to keep it very top line and simple. So therefore, I am dumbing it down a little bit, but we can essentially say this. You have the Emir of Qatar, who off the back of the World Cup has told major organizations to go out there and invest in sport and find a Premier League club. And at that point, lots of different organizations and individuals connected to the Emir and on his remit went out and saw what was in the market, which is why, for example, QSI spoke to Spurs about possible minority investment. And then, of course, flashing forwards, we've seen two major Premier League clubs in Liverpool and Manchester United effectively on the market. And that's changed things a little bit because there's simply more options out there. And then there have been discussions between different stakeholders from within Qatar about what the best approach is, both in terms of club, and Qatar has settled on Manchester United for now, and also in terms of approach. In other words, is it going to be majority investment, a full outright offer, or only a minority bid? And again, at the moment, but conversations have been fluid over the last 2 weeks, it's been settled upon that an outright offer is the preference. So then as soon as you hear outright offer, you have to structure that in a way that will satisfy UEFA and also the Premier League as well, because anyone connected has got to pass their owners and directors test. And that's where these three organizations come in, QSI can't have an outright bid for Manchester United, even though they're effectively the sports vehicle of Qatar. So they have to back off in a formal sense, and they're not involved. QIA could outright buy Manchester United, but there's a lot of overlap of personnel on their board and other organizations where there may be a conflict of interest. Nasser Al Khalifi sits on the QIA board. He's also the chairman of QSI. He's also the chairman of PSG. So immediately the Premier League would be arguing shadow influence and saying, even if we clear your model and your business plan, there's personnel connected to that organization, QIA, that are also connected to QSI, that are also connected to PSG. And I'm sure everyone's got a headache already, but I hope that that overview is relatively clear. So therefore, once you say the word outright, as opposed to potentially majority and certainly minority, you have to look at a model that is going to pass all of the checks, will satisfy UEFA, will satisfy the Premier League, and will be clear and transparent. And QIA are not necessarily the most transparent in everything they do. And to be clear, I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just the nature of these type of sovereign wealth funds and how they operate and what they own and who's involved and who's formally making decisions and who has informal influence. And we find this with PIF, we find this with a lot of sovereign wealth funds, that it can be very difficult for them to make clear their hierarchy, either because they don't wish to, it's not in their business interests, or simply making the hierarchy clear is irrelevant because there's somebody more senior or royal outside of that hierarchy that's still pulling all of the strings. And in essence, the money comes from the same place. So that's where a private fund makes things easier, because if you don't channel it via QIA and QSI can't do it, then private funds structurally, legally makes things simpler. And then, of course, assuming they bid, which is the expectation, we then have to work out the relationship between who is the front-facing private fund, is their relationship with QIA direct or indirect, and is there overlap of personnel that is going to cause any questions from both UEFA, the Premier League, and the fan base. And that would be the next important step. But I think that most that are familiar with discussions believe that they've settled upon a private fund because it's the smartest structural way of doing it. And then the reason why you constantly hear QIA and even people like Nasser Al Khalifi is essentially because these are key organizations that drive the strategy of the Emir of Qatar and are always going to be involved in the bid, involved in the strategy. And who knows, further down the line, potentially involved in Manchester United as well. So stage one is about how you structure a bid to satisfy UEFA and the Premier League and show no conflict and be as transparent as you can. And then stage two, if they were to be successful and actually acquire Manchester United, will be how they then structure their board and Manchester United itself. And if things progress, they're going to have to be very public and declare who they are, because obviously they have to go through the Premier League owners and directors test. It's not like they can come in the club with one pitch and then change their mind to another, because anybody incoming still has to pass the various tests, either when they acquire the club or further down the line. And again, they'll want to engage with the fan base and make clear who they are and what they're doing to avoid being seen as a secretive potential owner. So there's a lot of logistical hurdles. There's a lot of partners, both directly and indirectly involved. And then the other thing to say is, were they to, as expected, place this bid for an outright sale of Manchester United, price is going to be very interesting as well, because I understand that this so-called Glazer valuation of 6 to 8 billion is deemed by all parties that I've spoken to, not just the Qataris, as extremely high. And as a consequence, I think the scale of bids will be more like 3.5 billion, even a shade lower. And that is within, say, Jim Ratcliffe's thinking, through to maybe 4.5 billion at this stage. And that is quite a lot of money away from what the Glazers supposedly want to sell the entirety of the club. So then, depending on how many credible bidders there are, can the Rain Group and the Glazers create a bidding war? depending on due diligence further down the line, because you've only done a sort of superficial look at the club based upon the data center. So then as credible suitors are shortlisted, perhaps 2 or 3, if there isn't a standout bidder, they will then go back and do much more significant due diligence. They'll be talking about the handling of the debt. They'll be pricing up more accurately projected costs for things like an Old Trafford redevelopment or even a new stadium, working out whether this is value for money. But this shouldn't be construed with the Qataris as just bulldozing in with some above market value bid in order to get a club that they want. The number that they bid at, I think, is going to be competitive and strong. Strong is the word that sources are using, but not necessarily so sky high, so astronomical, so above any other suitor that the Glazers just turn around and say, yes, we accept very quickly. Thank you very much. We've got the best deal in the world. The way that these organizations do business is maybe a lot smarter than they're painted, because it's easy to just see they're really rich and say they're going to have the best bid. But as we saw with Chelsea, that wasn't the case. There was a Saudi bid for Chelsea. There was a lot of excitement about the Saudi bid before the deadline. There was a lot of talk that it was going to be sky high. There was a lot of fan excitement and also trepidation, in fairness, that it was going to be wholesale change, both in terms of crazy riches, but a completely new culture to the football club. And then when the shortlist was done, the Saudi bid didn't even make it. So just a word of caution on that front, that these Qatari organizations are not only looking for PR, they're also looking for business value, because they still need a return on investment somewhere further down the line.
That was going to be one of my main questions for you, is for a lot of people looking at a Qatari possible bid, we can have debates over who the correct and right owners of Manchester United would be, and I will do that once the bids are already in. I've scrutinised Dubai, I've scrutinised your Ratcliffe and Ineos, and I'll scrutinise a Qatari takeover bid. What would you say is the main purpose behind Qatar wanting to buy Manchester United? Because we know financially the QIA, as you said, it may well not be the QIA. I think they might be there. As far as I've seen, it was more like an advisory position in terms of, rather than being directly involved in the structure of the bid. But that's like 450 billion, I think they're in control of, the sovereign wealth fund. Like, Qatar don't need money, right? Is it the prestige of what is it? What is the reason why they want to go? Why the Emir wants to go into the Premier League and Premier League ownership after the World Cup?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. First of all, it is that post-World Cup legacy. So Qatar's put all of its efforts, all of its business needs, at least in the sports sector, around the World Cup. And now the World Cup has finished. There's a legacy aspect of that. And some of it will be about bringing elite level sport to Qatar, maybe including an Olympic bid. But other aspects are about taking ownership, whether minority, majority, or outright, in different elements of sport, not even specifically just football, in order to promote Qatar, which they would say is about PR and tourism, and critics would use the term sports washing. And then there's that return in investment aspect. Just because you're rich, it doesn't mean that you don't want more money. Just because you have seemingly an unlimited stream of wealth, it doesn't mean that you don't have to sustain that, because the market can change. And I think the UAE and Dubai specifically in particular saw that in 2008 when the market crashed and the entire emirate felt like it was sustainable, but doesn't have, like Abu Dhabi or Qatar, oil and gas. It relies on tourism. It relies on Western business. It relies on New York banks. And when the market crashed in 2008, Dubai was in big, big trouble, and the recession hit that emirate harder than most. So Qatar are conscious of that. And these so-called Vision 2030s for Qatar and for Saudi Arabia, which are broad government-endorsed strategies, are there to be fulfilled by different organizations in every single sector. And in essence, they say two things very simply. Number one, we need to improve the quality of life within our countries, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And two, we need to generate income that is not reliant on the oil and gas sector. And that's where sport comes in, because if you can get a return on investment and have the added bonus of being able to promote tourism and your country, and it's not tied to oil and gas, then you start to create a sustainable investment that is going to grow over time and is more stable, arguably.
Going to realistically be possible to separate that private investment group from Emir Al Thani? Whether indirect, I know it's going to be an indirect link, but is it possible for that to genuinely happen, or is it just a smart way for Qatari investment bid to be set up where ultimately the control, well, it will probably be indirect, would still be Emir Al Thani's?
It's always going to be government and royal, and everything about those two areas go back to Emir Al Thani. So we have to be very clear here that there is influence over the decision to bid. There is influence over who bids and how it's done. And all of that is being driven by Emir Al Thani. And then there is influence over Manchester United if the group is successful. And that's where it gets a bit more complicated. And if Emir Al Thani chose to have an active role over Manchester United, he would have to obviously be tested under the Premier League, and the PSG Manchester United situation would have to be resolved in some capacity. But it's more likely that there will only be a shadow influence. And this is where it gets quite complicated, because if the Emir is driving the strategy, if the Emir is driving who bids, if the Emir is close to those that are directly on Manchester United's board, if any organizations that the Emir is connected to are directly involved, then you can make a very strong argument that under the Premier League's owners and directors test, Emir Al Thani has to be looked at as a shadow director. And in addition to that, UEFA will have questions. But what complicates that is look at Newcastle United, where PIF came in and they were deemed to be separate from the Saudi Arabian government. And yet PIF's chairman is Mohammed bin Salman, and he was not tested as an owner or a director. So you could make an argument that if we just, and I'm being very superficial and we're coming outside of the reality of this private fund, but just to make a point, let's say hypothetically, Al Thani used a vehicle that he is directly involved within. That doesn't mean that the Premier League or UEFA would necessarily be able to prove that there is a connection and influence, which sounds ridiculous, because if the organization is owned and controlled by Al Thani, then how could there not be influence? And that's the practical element. But I come back again to PIF, who was seen to be separate from Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi Arabian government, to the point where none of the Saudi Arabian government members or Mohammed bin Salman were tested as shadow directors under the Premier League's owners and directors test when the Newcastle United takeover went through. And yet all you've got to do is go onto the PIF website, who own 80% of Newcastle, and see who's PIF's chairman. It's Mohammed bin Salman. And who are their board members? They're all royally appointed government members. And where does PIF's money come from? From the Saudi Central Bank, which is a government-only controlled fund that has entirely state money in it. So you can even make an argument that if a cash injection is put into PIF from the Saudi bank in order to make acquisitions during the pandemic, which was the case, then the very money paid to buy Newcastle United is government funded. The very organization that owns Newcastle United is run by Mohammed bin Salman. And yet, as far as the Premier League say they're concerned, without any real explanation, there is separation between PIF, between the government and between Newcastle United, to the point where they're satisfied that Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the chairman of Newcastle United and one of Mohammed bin Salman's closest aides, is not being influenced by Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government. Now, there's nothing wrong, by the way, with a government being involved, providing that they pass the tests and the structure is acceptable. But obviously, in the case of Mohammed bin Salman, and some would argue the Emir of Qatar, it's whether or not those individuals would pass the Premier League's owners and directors test. And Qatar will look at PIF and say, well, if they passed, of course, we should pass. And this is where precedent may come in. So that's the legal side, which is why the group, I don't think, have got any real concerns about being turned away because structurally they don't tick the right boxes. And that's because the structures are judged legally rather than subjectively. But there is this practical element that a private fund, a organization like QIA, if they're inputting somebody like Nasser Al-Khalifi, they're all important people with high-level government and royal connections, and every single person involved, regardless of who is the front-facing entity, are all fulfilling the vision of Emir Al Thani and his sports strategy. So by default, he has an influence in the decision to bid for Manchester United. But that is very different from after the group come in terms of who's on the board. Is there going to be a new chairman? Who is going to be the day-to-day operational control? Is the owner going to be hands-on?
I think it's a good point. You covered my next question there by speaking about the precedent, because I don't personally think this Qatari takeover bid would have reached this stage if the Qatari, whoever is going to lead that private investment fund, if they didn't have utter confidence that they would pass the Premier League owners test. And you got the precedent of what Newcastle done there. They wouldn't pass UEFA's rules about dual club ownership, and you've got the precedent of what Leipzig and Salzburg have done. So I think there's precedent from both the Premier League and the UEFA perspective. And I've completely forgotten what my question was. It's such a confusing situation. I'm laughing about it. It's not particularly. I don't know whether it's. There's obviously wider questions that have to be asked around, and I imagine that the same sort of scrutiny that happened around the Qatar World Cup will happen to do with anything to do with a potential takeover of Manchester United. But I just remember what my question was, and I don't know whether you actually know this one, but when Qatar, they bought 70% of PSG back in 2011, do you understand or know about what happened in those initial early stages in terms of the board? How long did it take for that structure to come at PSG with obviously Nasser Al-Khelaifi coming in as the chairman, and he was obviously linked with QSI? How did they structure that board at PSG, and what could, hypothetical, obviously purely hypothetical, what could United expect? Because I imagine there would have been lessons that they've learned that they did right or wrong with PSG that they would bring over to United, right?
Well, this is why Nasser Al-Khalifi is important, because he's the sports expert. So when he's being mentioned, it's about offering consultancy in effect. And that's because QSI, as you rightly say, have been through this before. But QSI have got their own return on investment strategy. And I think that's important to note. And buying PSG before the World Cup versus acquiring Manchester United after, at two very different prices as well, are two completely different things. But where there is overlap is that PSG on the football side are doing what Manchester United will need to do as well, which is invest, which is go far in the Champions League, which is win trophies, which is sort out their own stadium situation, because they only rent their stadium at the moment, the Parc des Princes, and they would like to buy that and redevelop that. So there are some overlaps. And also, we should look at Nasser Al-Khalifi in terms of other hats that he wears. So it's not only using him for advice because he's been heavily involved with QSI and PSG. It's also about thinking about how powerful he is within UEFA and the ECA. And if you need Alexander Ceferin on board with a bid for Manchester United and its structure, then you logically involve Nasser Al-Khalifi. It would be unthinkable that Al-Khalifi is not fully in the loop with everything being done, even if not directly involved within Manchester United. And really what QSI did at the time of buying PSG was see opportunism, a price that they thought was very valuable that they could get a return on. And if you look now, we see an example of that, because PSG are going to be taking on board a strategic investor that's going to come in the second quarter of 2023. And there's 3 groups at the moment, of which one is more advanced than the other 2. And 2 of those 3 groups are American. And PSG are going to be selling a stake of between 5 and 15%. It's not been decided yet, because each of the 3 bidders has made a slightly different offer for the club, but they won't sell more than 15%. But when you go for minority investment, you obviously still have to value 100% of the club and then work out what you're prepared to pay in terms of a percentage based off that 100% valuation. So all 3 suitors are valuing PSG at over 4 billion euros, which tells you that their return already is massive on that club. Now, people will look at Manchester United in that context and say, well, isn't that a way out? Aren't they looking to sell? And that's not my understanding, because QSI have also invested 23% in Braga. They're looking for a club in South America. They have got a venture in paddle away from football. So this is all about a return on investment for QSI, of which Nasser Al Khelaifi has been leading. And therefore, in Manchester United's context, it will be about finding a way of creating a model that does something similar, that maximizes commercial and brand growth, that modernizes the stadium. And of course, to do all of that, you have to get the football team qualifying pretty much automatically for the Champions League. And that's the thing that Manchester United have been lacking since the Sir Alex Ferguson days. Because if you don't pretty much know that you're going to make the Champions League, because history tells you it's season on season on season, you can't budget for that. And that's a very important and underrated point in all of this. And when clubs plan, they're doing so windows ahead. And it's quite hard to look at multiple windows ahead if you're not entirely sure if your transfer budget is going to be with a Champions League boost or without one. And although Chelsea haven't won in recent seasons the Premier Leagues that a Liverpool or a Manchester City have, they've done quite well to always be that third team people tend to mention and predict, even though we're not seeing it this season, that will be the ones that will pretty much automatically be in the top 4. So they can budget accordingly. Whereas Manchester United haven't been able to, Tottenham haven't been able to, Arsenal haven't been able to, and now maybe going forwards, Liverpool and Chelsea might not be able to. And it makes such a big difference. So then should this group come in, my understanding is that they will have that strategy in mind, but they won't make these wholesale changes before they come in. They will have some personnel that are going to have operational control. They may well have some local knowledge as well. And don't rule out, therefore, after a bid is placed, other groups pairing together. And if the Qatari group, there's been no real suggestion of this, but it's always a possibility, they might see someone that has been unsuccessful that they want to bring in because they value something in that pitch. They've held some conversations. They realize there's some local knowledge. But after they come in, it will be business as usual, as we saw with Chelsea, for probably the first 100 days, if not longer. And then at that point, maybe when they've got the summer window or a large proportion of it out the way, you'll start to see them, from being inside the football club rather than outside the football club, actually completing a review of the operations at all levels and then determining what they do need to change. So Chelsea set the example here. The Clear Lake Bowley group came in, they did a 100-day review at all levels, the men's team, the women's team, the commercial team, the board, and they decided, okay, we need to make wholesale changes. And they ended up having to make a lot very fast. I don't think that this group would quite be moving as fast as Chelsea, but it's that same mentality. And we're flashing miles ahead as well as the other just thing I want to underlie here, that this is an initial deadline. So people are saying, well, they wouldn't bid if they weren't serious. Well, they wouldn't bid if they didn't think they could win it. And that is fans talking in transfer terms. Qatar is the favorite. Why? Because there's a lot of hype about it. And a few weeks back, Jim Ratcliffe's going to be the favorite. Why? Because he's publicly declared. But within a takeover, the groups that say the least are often the most credible, and the ones that are the most secretive are usually the real contenders. So just bear that in mind, that there will be somebody that surprises us over the next few weeks. But to actually move you're not doing anything other than writing a small email saying what your valuation is and how much the club you want to buy and attaching proof of funds. Then the real due diligence happens. Then you fix upon the price. And then in all likelihood, somewhere down the line in the next 2 months, there will be a singular suitor that is named the exclusive preferred bidder and enters into a period to really try and get the deal done fast. But before that, it's actually quite easy to bid. And if I had 5 billion in my account, sadly I don't, I could pretty much write an email today and say, hello, Rain Group, you haven't heard from me, but I want to express late interest. Please give me access to the data center. On Friday, I'll give you my offer. And on Friday, I could attach my bank balance and an email and I would be in the race. So businesses don't do that because you're not stupid. You have to think seriously and do as much in depth as you can. But to actually bid, it doesn't take a lot. And this is where the proof of funds is very key, because it wards off suitors that only want a bit of PR, and therefore stops a group just coming out for a stock price increase or a bit of media hype and then saying, you know what, we weren't actually that interested, but you've got your benefit from that. And that's where Rain Group have to come in and do that due diligence to make sure that they separate the credible from the non-credible.
If I could ask you as a sort of maybe a final question, maybe another one after, what bids do you know of or do you expect that genuinely can actually compete with a Qatari takeover? Because my personal standpoint on the Jim Ratcliffe and the Ineos bid, I think a lot of United fans are looking at the debt refinancing conversations they're having with Goldman Sachs and are a little bit alarmed by that. It's showing that the Ineos's bid wouldn't be a cash bid in total, or at least part of it wouldn't be a cash. Is there anybody else? Because when Qatar came back in and the Qatari takeover conversation started, my immediate thought was, well, if Qatar think they can do it, I would probably expect the same thing to come from Saudi Arabia, which we haven't actually heard of yet. But I'm still kind of expecting something to happen in the next 48 hours. As I said, as a final note, is there anything that you're hearing behind the scenes of any other potential takeover bids? And do you expect anybody to genuinely be able to compete with Qatar if they do follow through on what we've seen in the last 2 weeks?
Well, I think, first of all, competing with Qatar is not a healthy way of looking at the situation this early in the takeover, because Qatar are not trying to blow suitors out of the water. Qatar are trying to place what they believe to be a market value offer and get the football club for a number that provides a return on investment. And therefore, they're not treating this like a transfer in a bidding war. No group would. Maybe later down the line, if there's 2 or 3 credible suitors, all around similar valuation, there's an opportunity for the Glazers to have a bit more leverage. But right now, suitors, if anything, are going to low ball. You're not going to come in with some insane offer that makes no business sense. So if Qatar bid big, it's because they see value in that, rather than out of vanity or rather than trying to win a race. And the highest bidder doesn't win on Friday, and it is a soft deadline. So you could also bid after the deadline. There'll be 2 or 3 in all likelihood that are put forward. So we have to be very careful not to be caught up, even if it transpires that Qatar are successful, in assuming that they're rich, they're going to outbid everyone, nobody's going to be able to compete. Because Qatar are trying to acquire a football club or invest in a football club without getting sucked into the Glazers game, without just meeting a number that they think is going to get a deal done. And that is more of a transfer mentality of saying, okay, if we were talking in millions, we would like to bid 4.5 million for a player. You want 8 million for a player. We're worried about 3 other clubs behind us. You know what? We'll just go up by another million, and then nobody else is going to match us, and we'll settle at 5.5 million. That extra what isn't 1 million, it's 1 billion, which is a massive amount of money. And if it becomes more than 1 billion, then you're pushing close to the 2.3 billion potentially that was paid as the base price for Chelsea Football Club. So when people are saying they might bid 5, they might bid 5.5, the Glazers want 6, maybe they'll get 6.5 or 7. if a bid comes in for 4.5 billion, which I think is more logical at this stage at the top end, maybe it's 5, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's 4.5 billion or even a shade less. If the Glazers were to counter and say, we'll only sell for 6.5, that's not a transfer. Just go up because you're rich by 2 billion. That whole 2 billion is the entire valuation pretty much of Chelsea Football Club. So you can understand why people will walk away. And therefore, I would expect the suitors, including Qatar, to stick to their guns, to stick to their valuation, and also to not go too high at this stage because they've simply not done complete due diligence. That comes further down the line when there's either a singular suitor in an exclusive period, if the process is skipped because one name stands out, or there's 2 or 3 that are put forwards. And then you really get to have a bit more back and forth. So therefore, we should be wary not to get too sucked into the social media snowball around everyone's got a Qatari flag by their handle. Everyone's really excited because they're rich. Everyone assumes they're serious, so they're going to blow the market out of the water. I would be a bit more cautious at this stage because I know that these groups think in business terms, not just in the vanity of trying to win a race. And then in terms of other groups, there is likely to be Saudi interest. There's certainly been a Saudi inquiry. Whether or not that transpires into a bid, we'll have to wait and see. But within Saudi Arabia, pretty much the same tactic as Qatar. And the only difference is that it would have to be structured as a private sector bid because the public sector has already got PIF and Newcastle United. And therefore, there would have to be clear separation between those two. But you have a number of people involved in the consultations within Saudi Arabia that may not put their face to it, but are very important. You've got Turki Al Sheikh, the owner of Almira, who, a bit like Nasser Al Khalifi, is consulted on everything. So if Saudi Arabia move, he's involved, at least in terms of advice and connections and support. But I would be surprised if he was the formal front-facing person behind it. And then you've also got Mohammed Al Khareji, who is a senior investor and deal maker that was the main kingpin, if you like, in bringing Cristiano Ronaldo to Al Nassr, in the sense that he was the one that found the funding. And Mohammed Al Khareji knows the Rain Group because he bid for Chelsea using the vehicle of Saudi Media Group. And it was a competitive bid on paper, but the source of funding was not entirely clear or transparent as to whether it would be borrowed, debt funded, or found a little bit later down the line. And as a consequence, even though they met a similar valuation to other groups, and they were even above some of the groups in terms of the number that they were prepared to bid, they were not put forwards as one of the 4 final bidders for Chelsea. But he, again, had a ready-made consortium and a decent chunk of what would be needed to buy Manchester United. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if he becomes a starting point for any Saudi bid, because Chelsea wasn't that long ago. And you don't go from having 2 billion or so, even a shade more, and wanting a Premier League asset, to just walking away rather than at least exploring the situation. So I think that there'll be a number of people, a bit like in Qatar from Saudi Arabia, that are thinking long and hard about what the best vehicle is to bid. And most of the same names involved in Chelsea from a Saudi Arabia perspective will be there again, because this is ultimately a unified approach that, much like Qatar, falls under their government and their own Vision 2030 and the sports strategy that comes with it. And from there, we'll see whether they bid. I think there's not as much hype at the moment about a Saudi bid. There's not as much definitiveness that they definitely will place it, but the Qataris are definitely worried or intrigued, whichever way you want to look at it, that there will be a rival bid from Saudi Arabia. And now we'll have to wait and see on Friday. And then we have to look at North America, which is being underreported, because that's where the vast majority of the interest from Chelsea came from. And this is, as I said from the very beginning of the process in my reporting, ultimately a process designed by Americans for Americans. That's what Rain Group do. So don't be surprised if there's a totally out the blue investment firm like Clearlake Capital, and I don't mean Clearlake Capital because they own Chelsea now, but I mean that type of vehicle that comes out the woodwork. Don't be surprised if somebody like Harris Blitzer, I think more in a minority sense, but who's to say who they'll partner with this time around? It won't be Sir Martin Broughton, but that was what happened with Chelsea. It was Broughton and Blitzer Harris. Don't be surprised if Blitzer Harris are in the mix because they want a Premier League asset. But I think if they were to enter as their own singular entity, it might well be more minority investment because they don't see the value in the overall price of Manchester United. Yeah. And then still at the back of my mind is Steve Pagliuca as well, the owner of Atlanta and the co-owner of the Boston Celtics. And there's no real indication at this point. There's no hints yet. But the whole Chelsea process, for those that are unaware, was reported by sources as having a secret bidder, a mystery bidder, and the name was not given. And when we got more to the business end, Pagliuca crept out the woodwork as that mystery bidder. And he was actually very credible and very serious and prepared to pay quite big. But it was just that there were two in particular, the Broughton Blitzer Harris bid and Clearlake Bowley, that were seen to be stronger in the end. But strong is only comparative. It doesn't mean that Pagliuca was not strong. It just means that there were four incredible bids. And I don't think you go from having four incredible bids. The Ricketts family were, of course, the other one, but they pulled out because the Chelsea fan base were not happy with that family. So they didn't choose to proceed. And I don't think they'll be in the mix for Manchester United either. But you don't go from having Clearlake Bowlake successful, Harris Blitzer out of America, Ricketts family very serious but pulled out, and Pagliuca, to having Manchester United and having no serious American challenge. So I think that there will be something from North America. Sources continue to say that there are familiar faces from the Chelsea process through to the Manchester United process, which is understandable because the Rain Group were managing both of them. So keep an eye out on North America as well, because I strongly believe if three groups are put forwards, I'll be staggered if one of them is not a North American group. And then, of course, there's Sir Jim Ratcliffe. And we have problems in terms of INEOS as well. Everyone's talking about Qatar and structure, Saudi Arabia and structure. But let's not forget that Jim Ratcliffe will have to resolve the Nice situation with INEOS if he's to succeed. And he'll have to meet the Glazers' valuation, which is why I wouldn't be surprised if Ratcliffe pushes hard, doesn't meet the valuation, both comparative to other suitors and comparative to the Glazers. And then if he wants to stay in the race, could very plausibly end up partnering with another group in order to have the perfect scenario for him, which I think would be operational control and PR and glory, but not have to front the price that the Glazers are looking for. And the last quick two things that I want to say, which I think need emphasizing, and I hope that people have bared with me and this to this point, because these are both very important, is one, Friday is not a climax. So don't be surprised if we hear nothing on Friday. I think everyone will look at it like deadline day and want to know who's bid, what amount, how many organizations, who's been put through. But it's a soft deadline. And tactically, you might wait until after the soft deadline to see who else creeps out the woodwork if there's any indication of what some other suitors have bid.
That's a good point.
So it's tactical as to when you place your bid. And actually, it can be in the interests of a suitor to wait until after the deadline and see what happens. But also, Rain have got to put the offers to the Glazers, discuss them, have feedback. So even though we might get public declarations in and around that period, don't be surprised if Friday's a big anticlimax. And actually, it's a few weeks down the line, or days certainly, before we learn a bit more. That is point number one. And I think point number two is just that the Glazers has an S on it. And people often forget that and talk about a sale to the Glazers, talk about a sale of Manchester United. But this is still a divided family. So when we're hearing about price, when we're hearing about minority investment versus outright sale, when we're hearing about different groups, there isn't yet any clarity within the family. And there might be soon. And gaining clarity is helped by having offers. So the next few weeks are key. But that is a very key point to stress in all of this, that the groups themselves are not dealing directly with the Glazers at this point. They're talking to Rain.
Yeah.
And when they get involved in the Glazers, in terms of that negotiation, you could well see different family members saying, well, if it's that amount, let's stay in the club. If it's that amount, let's just take it and we'll sell a bit later down the line when we think the club's worth even more. If that's going to fund our Old Trafford redevelopment, if that's going to take care of any debt, then great. Now we'll have more money to spend. We'll have a friendlier fan base, and the family are going to have to work out whether post-Super League, post-pandemic, post-foundational issues at the club, post-managerial change, there's too much bad blood and they just want out, or whether they actually think that they can win back the PR battle with the fan base and get to a position where staying at the football club might be tenable. My personal opinion is that if you go this far down the process with this amount of interest and this level of offers, to then not sell is not going to go down well at all with the fan base. But it's not only the Glazers' decision, because we're never going to see a narrative where the Glazers will say, well, we had a great offer for 5 billion, but we chose minority investment with a different offer. If they were to ever say that, and that was a hypothetical scenario, of course, they'd be outraged. But what if they go to Qatar and say, listen, you're offering 4.5 billion. We're not going to sell at 4.5 billion outright. But if you can get somewhere close to 5 billion, we're prepared to surrender 30% in the football club. And we're prepared over time to potentially, a bit like the 49ers Enterprises and Leeds United, give you the ability to increase that 30% to 40% in 2 years, and then to 51% in 5 years, and then to outright by 10 years. Yeah. And that gives them an outgoing. It allows the price to raise over time. And again, I'm talking purely hypothetically, but it's a two-way process. So if the Glazers stay and a hypothetically Qatari group come in, that's not because the Glazers have snubbed a Qatari group. It might be because the Qatari group also think that's in their best interest. So we're going to have to wait and see. But again, keep that point in mind that Friday could be an anticlimax and that Glazers has an S on it. And therefore, you're not dealing with a unified family at this point. And they're not going to be unified until they know what the offers are presented in front of them. Yeah.
I think, well, the fact that we've nearly been talking for an hour about this kind of highlights just how complicated it is and how much of it it's fair to point out. Friday it's a soft deadline. It's effectively the Rain Group squeezing, saying, look, if you're interested, play your hand. And whether or not we find out everything before Friday, this, in an ideal situation, they're aiming for a sale by the end of Q1. Will it be Qatar? Well, I hope that this conversation with Ben, thank you very much for your time today, mate, has helped you understand a little bit more, maybe about the structure of the bid, maybe a little bit more about the reasons behind why they would want to take over Manchester United. But no doubt this is a moving situation, and no doubt that we could probably have another conversation in a week or two, and we could probably speak for another hour. But Ben, I really, really appreciate your time today, man. Thank you very much for coming onto the channel and helping.
Yeah, of course. Happy to come on again. Like I say, once the bids have gone in, groups are going to have to be a bit more public because they'll want to start engaging with the fan base. That's what we saw with the Chelsea bid a week or so after the deadline. 4 or 5 main suitors before the shortlist was made were very apparent, and therefore I would expect the Qatari group definitely, if this expected bid goes in, to publicly declare. That may not be on Friday, but sources have said if they do proceed and place an outright bid, which is the expectation at this point, then they will come forwards and make their structure and their personnel directly involved a little clearer. So watch this space over the next few days or weeks, but hopefully the lay of the land and the suitors that are credible and directly involved by the end of February at least will be a little clearer.
Well, I look forward to chatting again. I look forward to, in my opinion, I look forward to the sale of Manchester United and getting rid of the Glazers. You mentioned there about the idea of them, and that is no chance that they get anywhere near back with the fans. So the bridges were burned a long, long time ago, and that's why we're looking forward to a different future with different owners. Who they will be, we don't know at this point. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Hope this has been an enjoyable episode. If you have enjoyed it, make sure you do subscribe. There'll no doubt be more in the future. And as I said, Ben, I really appreciate you coming on, man. Thank you very much.